So hopefully the rest of the group will be joining us by the end of the night. If not, then next week we should be together. I'll see if I can't figure out what went wrong. But this week we are doing 2 chapters. We're doing Genesis chapter 4 and 5 because Genesis chapter 5 will only take us about 5 minutes, if that. So beginning in Genesis chapter 4, we'll be reading verses 1 through 7, and because Shawnee is at work today, we don't have scriptures on the screen, so you'll need to follow along today. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived, and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in process of time it came to pass, that Cain brought to the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought to the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel, and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shall thou not be accepted. And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Okay, so starting here in verse 1, the word knew means to know by experience in the Hebrew. However, in this case, and this is common in Middle Eastern and Semitic languages, the word is used as a euphemism to describe sexual intercourse. And she conceived. This is the result of Adam knowing Eve, is a blessing, the fulfillment of the blessing bestowed upon man in Genesis 1 when God said that he blessed them and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. This is the beginning of that. And their first son that's named is Cain. Now it's likely and with a high degree of certainty that Cain is the firstborn of Adam and Eve. Now if Cain and Abel are not the 2 firstborn, then the incidents of their story here is to serve as a retelling of the first murderous act recorded, but it's fairly certain they are the first 2. Now Cain's name has 2 meanings. The first meaning is given right here in the text, and then there's a second meaning that actually comes from the word we get his name from. So the first meaning, it's given by Eve, it's to acquire. For Eve said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. Now this is the only time in the Bible that a newborn baby is described as being a man. And the second meaning, from its Hebrew root word, means to wail or to mourn. And I think this is fitting because it foreshadows the wailing, the mourning of Adam and Eve as they mourn the loss of Abel. In verse 2, she conceived again. Now for some reason, there are commentators who write that Cain and Abel are twins. But this text does not say that. This says conceived again, so this is down the line, down the road. Abel is certainly then the younger of the 2 brothers, and there is a contrast here with God's regular preference over the younger. If we read through the Bible, we will frequently see that the younger gets the blessing or gets preferred. We see this with Jacob and Esau. Jacob was the younger, but he received the promise. We also see this with Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael was the firstborn through Abraham's wife Sarah, through her handmaid Hagar, is where Ishmael came from. But Isaac, the secondborn recorded, got the birthright. Now Abel's name in Hebrew means vanity or mere breath. And this foretells of his existence being cut short as if it were a quick breath. And he is a keeper of the sheep. His trade is more in line with the original function of humanity, which was to have dominion over the creation, and Cain is a tiller of the ground. So like his father, he became a worker of the ground. the descriptions of both brothers, their jobs, prove something, and that is that men started from the very beginning of creation with domesticated animals and cultivated fields. This goes against the science and thinking that men lived for thousands of years as hunters and gatherers without these things, and with time came up with these methods of farming. From the very beginning we had it. Verse 3 says, in the process of time. Now some commentators interpret this to mean in a year, but this has to remain nothing more than conjecture. The ultimate timing here is unknown. Just at some point in time, they have sheep, they have crops, and they make an Abel first. Not Abel, Cain, sorry. Makes an offering of the fruit of the ground. So, Cain brings whatever is left over from his crop, and he offers it to the Lord. But Abel brings of his firstlings. Now the phrasing of the text plays an important role, an indicator, in interpreting the rest of the passage. Abel went out of his way to please God. Abel brought to God the choicest of his flock, the first of his flock, whereas Cain seemed to bring the offering as an afterthought, out of what's left, and did it more out of duty. It says that the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering. This is to be contrasted with the Lord's reception of Cain's offering in the next verse. Now, Hebrews 11:4 tells us of Abel's offering. It says, by faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. So Hebrews tells us what the difference between the two offerings was. Abel's offering was made by faith, and it was made in righteousness. Since we know that faith comes by hearing, this is what Romans 10 tells us, then we can conclude that God had taught Adam how to worship him, and Adam passed that knowledge down. The primary difference between the offering of Cain and Abel then is the condition of the heart. But unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. So while God respected Abel's offering, he did not respect Cain's offering. As mentioned previously, the contributing factor seems to be the motivation behind the offering. Where Abel offered out of worship and out of faith, Cain offered what's left motivated by duty. And here's what 1 John 3:12 says of Cain's offering. It says, not as Cain, who was of that wicked one, and slew his brother. And wherefore slew he him? Because his own works were evil, and his brother's righteous. So this tells us that Cain's works from the start were evil. It was out of wicked intent, not out of righteous intent. So it tells us then that Cain was wroth, which means angry, and his countenance fell. So rather than a desire to fix the Lord, rather than a desire to say, okay, God, what did I do wrong? How do I make this right? How do I do it proper? He instead becomes angry with his brother because he did well. Now this confirms the verdict from 1 John 3, that the works were evil. If his intent were righteous from the start, he would have repented and done better. But the evil intent, desire to persecute the godly people, and that happens today. That people with evil hearts and evil intent, they don't desire to do better. They desire to get rid of those who do well. So verse 6, God begins a conversation with Cain, and he says, why art thou wroth? Why is thy countenance fallen? He said, why are you angry? Why are you frowning? Now God knows the answer, but the dialogue is really meant to encourage Cain to repent. God is trying to convince him to not sin further, and we see this more into verse 7, where he says, if thou doest well, shall thou not be accepted. And accepted here has a literal meaning of lifted up. The encouragement, the advice of God is, if you do well, if you do righteous, your frown will disappear. All would be well. You would be accepted by me. I would have respect for your gift. And then there's a warning. He says, if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. This is a warning to Cain that should he continue down this path, that sin is waiting to take a hold of him. It's waiting to overcome him and to master him. He says that unto thee shall be his desire. So it's seeking to dominate and consume him. And he continues, thou shalt rule over him. Now what this means is God's telling Cain he must become the master of his sin if he is to be happy. But if he does not master the sin, if he does not overcome it, then it will consume him. Verses 8 to 10, we see the first murder in the Bible. And in this chapter, we actually see a few first. We'll get to those in a moment. And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. So he talked with his brother. That's the English translation. The Hebrew literal translation is told his brother. And the sense of the sentence in Hebrew is Cain told his brother to meet him in the field. Cain lured him out there. And then it came to pass when they were in the field, when they're far away from help, when Abel cannot cry out. This demonstrates, by the way, that the murderous act was premeditated. Cain had thought about this, he planned it out, and then he committed it. Out in the field he rose up against Abel and slew him. In our last chunk of passage, God encouraged Cain to do good and master the sin, or else the sin would seek to master him. But rather than take this advice of God, Cain instead murdered Abel into jealousy. Now this here should be contrasted with Eve. Eve had to be talked into sin. She had to be convinced that sinning was the right thing to do, whereas Cain had to be talked out, and even with getting advice and encouragement from God, still committed the act. And that's why 1 John 3 says that he was of the evil one. Sin had already had a hold of him. God says, where is Abel thy brother? Now, like with the question that God asked Adam in Genesis 3, this question is rhetorical because God knows where Abel is. That he identifies this in verse 10. Rather than asking for knowledge, he's asking to allow Cain to come forth and to admit what he's done. But instead, Cain says, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? This is interesting. In chapter 3 last week, Adam was somewhat truthful. He at least told a half-truth in his reply. Adam said, when God said, where are you? He said, I was naked and afraid, which was an admittance to committing a sin. But here, Cain answers God with an outright lie. He says, I don't know. I don't know where he's at. But he knows where he's at. He killed him and left the body. Then he says, am I my brother's keeper? Now, keeper is a word used to describe shepherd. So he's saying, am I my brother's shepherd? Am I the shepherd of the shepherd? And he does that really to try and solidify his claim of not knowing. You know, I'm not in charge of him. I don't watch him. How should I know where he's at? God answers, what hast thou done? Again, rhetorical. And rather than waiting for a response, he says, the voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. So God then describes that he's aware of Cain's murderous act. He describes it by the voice of his blood crying for vengeance. Now to the Hebrews, this statement was critical and well understood, because the Hebrews understood that life is in the blood. So the life of Abel is crying out. Now the reason murder is so wrong is because we are made in the divine image of God. For that reason we see in the books of the law, in Leviticus, that the taking of human life cannot go unavenged. It has to be paid for. Verses 11 through 16. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. And Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth. And from thy face shall I be hid. And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And now, this is the transition that describes the act of dealing out divine punishment. He says, thou art cursed from the earth. This should be contrasted with the last chapter. Remember, with the fall of Adam, there was a curse. But man was not cursed. The earth was cursed for the sake of man. Whereas here, the curse is direct. Cain himself is the one who is cursed, and he is cursed from the earth. It says, which opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood. The land which had given to the inhabitants provided food. It was now fed by the blood of Abel. Now in verse 12 there are two punishments that God gives to Cain. The first, he says, when thou tillest the ground, it shall not yield her strength. So this is the nature of how he's cursed from the ground. Notice that the punishment is dealt in the original fall with what the creations were intended for. With man, we were intended to work, and so work was cursed. With woman, they were intended to give childbirth, and so labor was given pain. The serpent was given a punishment. So likewise here, Cain's punishment follows with his action and with his line of work. Now the text, when it says, shall not yield her strength, doesn't mean that it won't grow for him, but it means that his yield, he'll have little result for the amount of work that he puts in. Then a fugitive and a vagabond shall thou be. The second curse here is that he would be banished from his home. Vagabond, its definition is a wanderer, an aimless wanderer. So his curse is that he should leave and wander around without any real direction. The punishment includes leaving Adam and Eve, leaving his parents, leaving the land that he grew up in, leaving everything that he has known and being an outcast. The punishment will serve as a continual reminder of his sin. And many interpret this to mean that Cain would never settle down. And that's what the word indicates, but what we'll see in the next passage of verse is that Cain did at least settle down long enough to build a city. However, there is some question whether or not Cain did build that city. So if the curse is intended to keep him continually on the move, then in rebellion he outright defied God and the consequence of his actions. Now some commentators, however, see the expulsion, the vagabond curse, as only being expelled from his family and land of origin. But Cain says, he complains, my punishment is greater than I can bear. He says, God, it's too severe for me. And now bear means to pay the price, to suffer the consequence. However, in verse 14, we're going to see that the punishment isn't what he's complaining about. He's complaining about not wanting retribution from others. Now, though God only gives 2 punishment, Cain sees 4. He describes them as, you have driven me from the face of the earth. Cain, like Adam, places blame upon God. Remember, Adam says, it was that woman that you gave me. And Cain kind of says the same thing, you have driven me away. This is in reference to the curse that he would not be a productive farmer again. Then he says, from thy face shall I be hid. The second punishment that Cain sees is that he will be outcast from the presence of the Lord. But this is only true of people who do not repent. People who are unfaithful. The repentant, the faithful person can approach the grace of God. We'll have notes on that in verse 16. And he says, I shall be a vagabond, echoing the second punishment. And then he says, everyone that findeth me shall slay me. Right here, this is what his issue is. He doesn't care about the punishment. He cares about the fact that he fears other people would slay him. Now, being separated from God is what leads to fear. Those who are in the presence of God don't have this fear. And separation from God is a choice only of the unrepentant. This isn't God's choice. So God says in verse 15, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. So God extends a little mercy upon Cain. He gives a promise of protection. And some see this as a lessening of his punishment, but that does not really appear to be the intent of God. However, God does extend mercy, and essentially becomes his divine protector. Now, sevenfold refers to complete and divine vengeance with God as the agent. Then the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. So the mark upon Cain has been grossly abused in religion. Oftentimes the mark is seen as the curse itself, and it's been interpreted as a darkening of skin. For many people, they see the African race as being the descendants of Cain because they have black skin. And this incorrect viewing of the Africans comes as an incorrect interpretation of the passage. So there are 2 things that must be dealt with. The first is, even if the mark was the curse upon Cain, today we could not find any descendants of Cain because they all perished in Noah's flood. Only the godly line survived the flood. The ungodly line of Cain disappeared. So that removes the possibility of Africans being his descendants. And number 2, the mark of Cain is never identified in the Bible. We don't know what form this mark exists. Did it exist as like a physical mark on him? Did it exist as a sign? We don't know what form this had taken on. Now, the mark that's given to Cain, it does not serve as a curse. Notice it has nothing to do with his curse, but it serves as a warning to other people who saw Cain that if they messed with him, they would have to deal with God. God would take vengeance out on them. And verse 16, Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. The author makes sure he's very clear about this detail. It's Cain who abandoned the presence of God. The Lord did not abandon Cain. This is very important to remember because God never abandons people. The result is always on the part of the unrepentant person. And he dwelt in the land of Nod. Now the land of Nod is described as being east of Eden. It's unclear, however, if the Hebrews even knew where this land was. But the location is not important to the understanding of the text. What we need to understand is the meaning of Nod. The word Nod literally means land of wandering. So the place that he dwelt was a continual reminder of his punishment. Verses 17 through 24. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived, and bare Enoch. And he builded a city, and called the name of the city, after the name of a son, Enoch. And unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begat Mahajael, and Mahajael begat Methuselah, and Methuselah begat Lamech. And Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of the one was Adah, and the name of the other was Zillah. And Adah bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all, such as handle the harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer of brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said unto his wives, Adah and Zillah, Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man according to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 70 and 7-fold. So Cain knew his wife. As with the very beginning of the chapter, knew is used to describe a sexual relationship. And it's been suggested that this text actually indicates Cain was married before he murdered Abel. Because it doesn't say he found a wife, it says he knew his wife, but this is still only speculation when he got married. Now we know that Cain had founded a family. As such, we see that only a biased account would attribute strictly bad will toward Cain. He had a family, he had a life, it was just a cursed life. And then his wife bare Enoch, and then he built a city and named the city Enoch. Now commentators debate back and forth over who built the city, because the structure in the Hebrew is a little awkward. Enoch's name means to dedicate, or the dedicator, and it's been supposed that he is the dedicator of cities. The text also allows for Enoch to be the city founder, which, if the case, removes the contextual issue of Cain being condemned to a life of never settling down. However, the text also makes it apparent that Cain is the builder, because it says that he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Now, built a city. There are a lot of people who criticize this statement because they're like, well, Cain and Abel are the first 2 born. How did he build a city? There's no one else yet. So a couple of thoughts. It's not mentioned how many people were born between the birth of Cain and Abel and the birth of Seth. It's not mentioned how many were born prior to Cain, if any. Not likely. It's not mentioned how many years down the road this city was built. Remember, the lifespan of people back then were upwards of 1,000 years. So this could be 600-700 years down the road. We don't know. Now, say this is 500-600 years down the road. There could be several 100,000 people on the earth by this point. And the final point of consideration is what defines a city. A lot of people read this and they say that it cannot be true or accurate because they define cities the same way we define cities today. So with that in mind, what is a biblical definition of a city? And for consideration, the city of Jerusalem, one of the most famous cities in the Bible, in King Solomon's day, was only 40 acres in size. I own property that's bigger than that. Now the population during Solomon's day had a max of 2,000 people. Of the 40 acres, only 15 acres was actually the city. The other 25 acres was set aside for the temple and the temple land and the operations. So the city itself was 15 acres. Now during King David's rule, one of the most famous people in the Bible, the city is said to be between 800 and 1,200 people. Today we don't consider that a city. But that was the size of the city in 900 BC. So it's not unrealistic for Cain to have built a city. Verse 18, two names here to mention, Enoch and Lamech. And these two names are also recorded in Adam's line through Seth, but they should not be confused as the same people. They are different people. Verse 19, Lamech took upon him 2 wives. Now God instituted a marriage between one man and one woman. Lamech, in the first mention of polygamy in the Bible, continues in Cain's rebellion by taking upon himself 2 wives. Starting in verse 20 through 22, we have Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain. Each of these names will be addressed through verse 22, and they all derive from the same Hebrew word, which means to produce. Each of these people are described as being the father of a specific trade, and their names likely refer to their inventiveness. So Jabal, the father of such that dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. So the shepherding work of Abel is described as returning. However, this is more than a restoration of the work. Abel shepherded a minical flock which consisted only of sheep, of which he lived off. Jabal's description is one who has sheep and goats and cattle and all sorts of herd animals. He not only lived off of the flock, but he could trade from the flock. Jubal is the father of such that handle the harp and the organ. He's the father of those who play musical instruments. This is where poetry and music start to enter into the world. And then Tubal-Cain. He's the instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. So he fathered those who were skilled in metalworking and smithery. And what we see from all 3 of these people is that gifts and talents of the world are not reserved strictly to believers. The ungodly people are given gifts as well. And verse 23 and 24, this is slightly weird and difficult to understand without digging into it. He says to his wives, listen to my words. He says, for I have slain a man to my wounding and a young man to my hurt. Now the first time I read this, I read it kind of like as a plea. Like where he's saying, hey, listen to me because I'm in trouble. I've slain a man. But when going back to the Hebrew, he's not pleading. He's not worried. He's boasting. He is bragging. He's like, I slayed a man. Look at me. I'm big and mighty. This is what he's doing. He says, to my wounding and to my hurt. This is describing his reason for slaying the man. Is this man had hit him or bruised him, and he killed him for it. And then he says, if Cain should be avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 70 and 7-fold. So this describes a sharp contrast between Cain and Lamech. Cain had sought protection. He just sought to not be retaliated against, but Lamech seeks violence. The line of Cain shows how quickly sin had progressed into the world, to such a point that now man is boasting in sin. In fact, next week, we're going to see that God gets ready to destroy the world because of sin. So it happens fast. Verses 25 through 26, Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth. For God, she said, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began man to call upon the name of the Lord. So she bare a son and called his name Seth. The final 2 verses of the chapter transition back into the line of Adam, the godly line through Seth, and this will introduce us to chapter 5. Now the reasoning for the name that Eve gives is, God hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel. And the name literally means substituted, or is substituted, or appointed, is appointed. So there's a possible connection, kind of a pun here with the name, where Eve says, for Seth is given as a substitution, appointed in the place of Abel. Now the birth of Seth occurs 130 years into Adam's life. Whether or not others listed between Abel and Seth, it is understood and concluded that there were others born in this period of time. One such evidence is that Cain has a wife. So this means that there were people born in between Cain and Abel and Seth. They're just not listed. We don't know who they are. And then Enosh, this is the 3rd generation recorded through the line of Seth. Enosh of Adam into Seth. Enosh has a name that means mortal or mortality. And I'll get into why these names are important in a minute. Then began man to call upon the name of the Lord. The translation, as it is, shows us men beginning the practice of worshiping God. The Hebrew word also has another definition. The root language means began to call themselves by the name of the Lord. Now the understanding of this from the root word becomes critical in the interpretation of Genesis 6 next week. So just keep this in the back of your mind next week when we meet again. Now while the men have been known to go to the Lord, for example, both Cain and Abel brought sacrifices, brought offerings to the Lord, the tense here indicates a transition from irregular worship to regular worship, a practice that carries on. So chapter 5, I'm going to read the entire chapter, and then I have comments on 3 verses, and then I have a chart we're going to get into real quick. So starting in verse 1, this is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. So this is a recap of chapters 1 and 2 real quick, that verse. And Adam lived 130 years, and begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. And the days of Adam, after he had begotten Seth, were 800 years. And he begat sons and daughters. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. And Seth lived 105 years, and begat Enos. And Seth lived after he begat Enos 807 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. And Enos lived 90 years, and begat Canaan. And Enos lived after he begot Canaan 815 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enos were 905 years, and he died. And Canaan lived 70 years, and begat Mahalalel. And Canaan lived after he begot Mahalalel 840 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. And Mahalalel lived 65 years, and begat Jared. And Mahalalel lived after he begat Jared 830 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. And Jared lived 162 years, and begot Enoch. And Jared lived after he begot Enoch 800 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. And Enoch lived 65 years, and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And Methuselah lived 187 years, and begat Lamech. Methuselah lived after he begat Lamech 782 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. And Lamech lived 182 years, and begat a son, and called his name Noah, saying, The same shall comfort us concerning the work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord had cursed. And Lamech lived after he begat Noah 595 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. And Noah was 500 years old, and begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So a lot of names, years, and begats in this chapter that almost seems pointless, except they serve a few things. The first thing is we actually just read the gospel, and I'll explain that in a moment, but we just read the gospel. The second is this gives an account so that we can trace the lineage to Christ. That's why we need this account, is to get all the way back, all the way to Christ. And then the third purpose that this serves is it actually allows us to date how old the earth is from creation. Now, one day I might go through and actually show you all the places we find dates, and we can date from creation all the way to the death of Christ. And then we know how long it's been, but I'm not going to do that today. I'm only going to get into it a little bit. But verse 1, the word generations. The book of Genesis is broken up into many sections, and each major section will begin with one of two phrases. Either these are the generations of, or this is the book of the generations of. So verse 1 begins an entirely new section in this account. Now in verses 21 through 24, in verses 21 through 24, Hebrews 11:5 says of Enoch, says, By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found, because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony, that he pleased God. So Enoch walked with the Lord. Enoch had a faith. He wasn't perfect, because all men have sinned. But he had such a faith that God took him off the earth without him dying. Now, many commentators have suggested that the length of his life, which is 365 years, either suggest a fulfilled life, which is possible, a nice round life, or suggest the length of a year. Now, the latter case, the length of a year, I find unlikely as the meaning, because the Jewish year has 355 days in it, not 365. Now, in both of these cases, they are only speculation. Now, there are other religions, one of them predominant to my area, the LDS Church, that teaches Enoch built an entire city that was so righteous that the whole city was lifted up to heaven. Of such a city, the Bible makes no mention. In fact, all the way from Genesis to Revelation, the only thing we know of Enoch is that he was righteous and never died. That's all that we know. We know his age. So when you hear teachings like this, it should be disregarded as false, because there is nothing to support that claim anywhere. And verse 27, Methuselah, I put him in here for two reasons. Reason one, he's the oldest person to live. He died at 969 years old. I don't want to live that long, just saying. But we live in different times too, with different conditions. Now the second reason, second point of interest to me, is the meaning of his name. His name literally means his death shall bring. And this is interesting, one, for the gospel message that we're about to get to, but two, the same year that Methuselah died is the year of the worldwide flood. So that's kind of cool with the meaning of his name. So I'm going to switch my view here. I'm going to go small, pick and pick. There we go. So you'll see on your screen I've got a chart. I'm going to quickly explain the columns to you. So the first column says name. And so I have the name of each person listed in Genesis 5, starting with Adam, Seth, Enosh, so on and so forth. With Adam, I do have a year under his name. And that's because that is the year he was created, if we date everything used in the Bible, about 4004 BC. The next column is that person's age when they had the child that is recorded as the next in line in the chapter. This is what we use to date the earth. The second age is the third column, is the earth's age at the birth of that child. So the earth, for example, with Adam, was 130 years old when Adam gave birth to Seth, or when Eve gave birth to Seth. The next column is the person's age when they died, and the last column is titled Meaning of Name. Now, this column, highlight, keep, write down, do whatever you want to do, because this is the gospel message when we take the meaning of everybody's name. So, real quick, we have Adam was 130 when he gave birth to Seth. Seth 105 when he gave birth to Enosh. Enosh was 90. Canaan was 70. Actually, I should go down. We read that in the Bible. I want to go through the age of the earth. So when Seth was born, the earth was 130. When Enosh was born, the earth was 235 years old. When Enosh was born, when Canaan was born, the earth was 325. When Mahalalel was born, the earth was 395. When Jared is born, the earth is 460 years old. When Enoch is born, the earth is 622 years old. When Methuselah is born, the earth is 687 years old. When Lamech is born, the earth is 874 years old. When Noah is born, the earth is 1,056 years old. And then the flood, when the flood came, the earth was 1,656 years old. Now underneath each of these ages, you'll see that I put the BC equivalent. So the flood occurred roughly, give or take a few years, in 2348 BC. Now the meaning of the names. Adam's name means man. Seth's name means substituted or appointed. Enosh means mortal. Canaan means dwelling or sorrow. Mahalalel means praiseworthy God. Jared means come down. Enoch means teaching. Methuselah means his death shall bring. Lamech means the lost or the despairing. And Noah's name means rest. So if we read this, not as their names, but the meaning of their names. You read, man is appointed, mortal, sorrow, or dwelling. But the praiseworthy God shall come down teaching, that his death shall bring the despairing rest. There's the gospel message in Genesis chapter 5. This chart, by the way, is available in the commentary. It's already on the app. So if you want to get this chart, it's in the app, or I can email it to you guys, print it out, mail it, whatever. Let's close in prayer, and then I'll end the stream and take some questions. Father God, Lord Jesus, Lord, we thank you and praise you for this day. Lord, we thank you that we can gather together and study your word. And Lord, I just pray that we can walk away with a deeper understanding of your word, that we can walk away with an understanding of the gospel, and that we can walk away glorifying and praising you. Lord, thank you for giving us this knowledge, this word. Thank you for leading us and directing us. Lord, I pray for all of those who need you at this time, that you'll take care of their needs. I pray for those who are absent, that whatever's holding them up, whatever's got them going on, Lord, I just pray that you'll take care of it for them, that you'll help them, that you'll get them through it. And Lord, I pray that we can be lighthouses to our neighbors, to our cities, to our nation, into the world. Lord, we thank you, love you, and praise you. In Jesus'